Nicholas of CUSA was one of the most brilliant and creative thinkers of his time. For us today, his thought can help us understand the origins of modernity, and he is a fruitful conversation partner for contemporary theology. Living in the 15th century, Cusanus was a man of paradoxes. He was rooted in the piety and worldview of medieval Christendom, and yet also deeply attuned to the new humanist and scientific spirit of his age. He was a penetrating intellectual, and yet also a man of action who continually struggled for church reform. He dug deep in the riches of Europe's classical inheritance and simultaneously had a remarkable openness to look for truth beyond well-trodden paths. In all of that, Nicholas of CUSA's thought somehow bridges the Middle Ages and modernity. But how exactly does his work relate to modernity? Did it possibly influence modernity? This remains a hotly disputed topic. Some think that Nicholas was the first modern philosopher. Ernst Cassirer famously held that Cusanus not only anticipated what we now know as modernity, but also accelerated its development. For Cassirer and others, Cusanus was essentially a forerunner to Immanuel Kant. This is a first option of how to see the relationship between Cusanus and modernity. A second option is to see Cusanus as somebody who was accidentally modern. Hans Blumenberg, for instance, read him in this way. Interpreters like Blumenberg believe that Cusanus' thought prepared the way for modernity, but that Cusanus himself was unaware of that. In other words, they see modern themes in Nicholas's work, but they think that his real concern was to sustain the medieval Christian synthesis, not to bring about something new. In this view, Nicholas's thought is ultimately not quite coherent, and he is somebody who remains caught between the Middle Ages and modernity. But there is a third view of the relationship between Nicholas of CUSA's thought and modernity, and this is to see in him a proponent of a different kind of modernity. Here, Cusanus is seen as an innovative Renaissance thinker who drew creatively upon medieval sources to pave the way for an alternative modernity than the one we know. Historically, this different modernity did not become influential, but it may still be fruitful for us to resource ourselves in it. So, was Cusanus a pioneer of modernity? Was he merely accidentally modern, or does his thought offer an alternative modernity? Whichever way we answer these questions, it is evident that Nicholas's work relates to our time, that it has something to say to us. In this video, my focus will be on what Cusanus has to say to theology, especially philosophically inclined theology. It is worth saying, however, that Nicholas of CUSA's intellectual legacy touches on many other areas too. In fact, it fascinates an unusually broad range of people, from astronomers and mathematicians to political theorists and philosophers. To see why this is so, and to give you a bit of context, I will first give you an overview of Nicholas's life and work, and the intellectual context he worked in. After this, I will explain the ideas Cusanus is most famous for, learned ignorance, and the coincidence of opposites. I will also consider the role of Christology for his thought. And at the very end, I will come back to the question of how Nicholas of CUSA's thought relates to modernity. So, who was Nicholas of CUSA? He lived from 1401 until 1464. This means he lived at the very end of what we normally call the Middle Ages, and he died a good 50 years before the Reformation started with Martin Luther. As for how Nicholas lived, somebody once said that he was the only philosopher who also led a busy life. This is obviously to be taken with a grain of salt, but it is true that his life was busy. He not only wrote extensively as a scholar, he also spent much of his life travelling throughout Europe and beyond as a kind of diplomat for the church. But let's start at the beginning. Nicholas was born in CUSA, a small town in present-day Germany, near the border to Luxembourg. CUSA is Latinized as CUSA, which is why we call the man Nicholas of CUSA. Sometimes he is also referred to as the Cusan, or again in the Latin version as Cusanus. His family was a prosperous merchant family, but was not part of the upper classes. Coming from this background, it was actually remarkable that Cusanus made it to the very top of the church hierarchy, being eventually made a cardinal and a bishop, and being friends with various popes. How did he get there? Well, He first studied canon law at Heidelberg and in Padua, and was ordained a priest. Among Italian humanists, he then became well known as a discoverer of classical manuscripts, which he dug up in German libraries. In the church, he started to make a name for himself at the Council of Basel in the 1430s. This council is particularly known for its disputes about the relationship between the authority of the Pope and the authority of councils. Cusanus wrote one of his first works on this question. In De Concordantia Catholica, or the Catholic Concordance, he tries to outline an ecclesial political system which balances hierarchy with consent. This work is still studied by political theorists today. From there, Cusanus started a career in the service of the Church. An important moment came when Pope Eugenius IV sent him as a messenger to Constantinople to prepare for a council of reunion between the Eastern and the Western Church. As somebody who knew Greek from his study of manuscripts, he was well suited for this task. And he seemed to have been successful. He travelled back from Constantinople with the Greek emperor, the Patriarch of Constantinople, and other high officials from the Eastern Church. Their journey from Constantinople, which is present-day Istanbul, back to Venice in Italy was by boat and took more than 3 months. It's hard to imagine for us today. On this journey, Nicholas had a moment of profound inspiration. In his own words, he received a heavenly gift from the Father of Lights. This gift was an insight that was to guide his life's work from then on. The insight that God in himself is incomprehensible for the human mind, but that we can still know something about God if we humbly acknowledge our own ignorance. There is, and this is the point, an understanding that is non-grasping, or to turn it around, there is an ignorance that is learned. Learned ignorance, or Docta Ignorantia, is in fact the name of the book that Cusanus wrote based on this insight. It is one of his most important and most famous works, and I will come back to it later. After De Docta Ignorantia, Cusanus wrote many more theological and philosophical works. He tried again and again to refine and recast the revelation he received at sea. In De Conjecturis, for instance, he explored what it means for our understanding of truth if we take seriously that ultimate truth about God is unattainable from our finite perspective. It means, as the title On Conjectures already says, that we are to conjecture. Conjectures for Cusanus are a kind of statement that participates in the truth, but also in a certain otherness. Nicholas also wrote essays called On the Hidden God, On Seeking God, and On the Father of Lights. And you can see from the titles, he kept thinking about the mystery of God and how God, whose essence is not entirely revealed to us, can still be known by us. At the same time, Cusanus also wrote several works on mathematics. This may sound surprising, as today theology and mathematics may be quite different fields. But what really fascinated Cusanus about maths was the precision that our mind can reach when we apply ourselves to numbers or to geometry. And because he was so taken by the question what we can know precisely and what we can't, it is no surprise that he was drawn to mathematics, where, at least for him, precision is possible. In 1448, Cusanus was made a cardinal, which means he became a member of the highest governing body of the Roman Church. Soon after, the Pope commissioned him to travel through the German lands as his legate, which means that he carried the full authority of the Pope during this journey. The goal of the journey was a pastoral one. Cusanus was to attend to the state of parishes, reforming them when needed. So wherever he travelled, he preached. He preached against the superficial religiosity and focused above all on the Eucharist as the sacrament where Christ is present. He wanted to convey the basics of the faith to all the people, so he had panels hung in churches with the Lord's Prayer, the Hail Mary, the Apostles' Creed and the Ten Commandments on them. He also attended to practical matters. He pronounced decrees which prohibited priests from having concubines, forbade financial abuse in the church, tried to reform the life of monks and nuns, and required a certain dignity during worship services. Of course, these reforms were not always welcome. He encountered opposition. And here, the sources tell us that Cusanus found it hard to compromise. He felt strongly that it was his duty to do what he thought was right, cost it what it may. So some of his contemporaries called him thick-headed and inflexible because of that. This assessment stands in an interesting contrast to how we encounter Cusanus in his works that stem from the same time. He mainly writes dialogues now, a form that is anything but inflexible or rigid. No, he is inventive and even daring in what he writes, a very different man to the one who was perceived to be authoritative and stiff. For instance, in a dialogue called The Layperson on the Mind, Idiota de Mente, Cusanus imagines a conversation between a craftsman, a philosopher, and an orator. Surprisingly, and indeed shockingly, it is the craftsman who is clearly the most insightful conversation partner, not the philosopher. The craftsman makes spoons, and precisely by drawing on this craft, he reaches deep insights about the human mind and its relationship to the divine mind. Cusanus deeply believed that one need not be specially educated to have insight into the mysteries of the world and of God. Wisdom, he thought, can be found everywhere if we only look for it. In pursuing a craft, or even in playing a game. There is this dialogue called The Game of Spheres, where Cusanus tells us about the time he met with the young sons of the Duke of Bavaria and showed them a ball game. Playing the game, he taught them how the game stands for our life and for how we may approach union with God. Again, there's a daringness and a newness in this kind of approach. It is a style of teaching and writing that is very unlike the scholastic schoolbook learning of his day. Returning once again to his life, Cusanus was also appointed Bishop of Brixen in the mountains of northern Italy. Here, like on his travels through Germany, he applied the same zeal for reform. He wanted to turn the diocese into a model for how to reform the church. But things did not go well. The local duke resisted Nicholas's efforts, and Nicholas was, in the end, threatened and forced to leave his own diocese. He returned to Rome, where he served as an advisor to the Pope until his death. His experience in Brixen left the old cardinal very pessimistic. In a gloomy moment, he is reported to have said to the Pope, "People don't listen to me when I urge them to do what is right." A gloomy pessimism, and still, mentally, Cusanus was as agile as ever. Even during his last years, his hunt for wisdom went on. Almost every year he produced new essays. One is indeed called The Hunt for Wisdom, De Venatione Sapientiae. Another one is called On Actualized Possibility, De Possessed. And yet another one on the not other, De Non Aliud. Even from these titles, we can gather that Nicholas's hunt for wisdom got more and more innovative, looking for truth beyond traditional boundaries between actuality and possibility, or between sameness and otherness. And there's one more work I want to mention before I end this section on the life and work of Cusanus. It's called De Visione Dei, or On the Vision of God. It's his most mystical work, originally written for a group of monks who asked Cusanus to explain to them how they could see or experience God. It is a beautiful and spiritually really rich work. If you have not read any CUSAN work before, it may be a good idea to start here. But for now, let us move on from this overview and dive a little more deeply into some of the ideas that we have touched on. The two ideas that Cusanus is most famous for are his call for a learned ignorance and his doctrine of the coincidence of opposites. We're going to spend some time on each of these and also on how Christ is the center of Nicholas's theological and metaphysical system. After this, we will be equipped to return to the question with which we began about the relationship between Nicholas's work and modernity. But in order to understand Nicholas's ideas, it is useful to consider first some of the intellectual context in which he was working. Specifically, he lived at a time when there was some significant disagreement over the right use of philosophy and theology. Let me explain. Since the second half of the 12th century, Aristotelian philosophy had gained great influence in theology. Aristotle was seen as an ally to the Christian faith. His arguments for the immortality of the soul, for instance, seemed to support what Christian theology was teaching. But should one bring in Aristotelian philosophy into theology? Should one use philosophical logic in matters of faith? The Aristotelians among the theologians thought so, yes. They thought that Aristotle's arguments could be fruitfully used to make Christianity reasonable. Others, however, disagreed with this. Christianity should not, in the first place, be made reasonable, they thought, because it should be taken on trust. This latter position, associated with the so-called via moderna, stressed the sense in which Christian truths are revealed to us by grace. Thus, exponents of the via moderna questioned the usefulness of philosophical logic in matters of theology, especially in the interpretation of Scripture. In other words, they thought that there are important areas in theology where we must take the truth of revelation by faith and should not try to reason our way to that truth. So we have a duality between an Aristotelian-influenced theology on the one hand and a kind of theology which stresses that faith is beyond a philosophical logic on the other hand. Cusanus, interestingly, goes beyond this duality. As we will see in more detail later, he decidedly goes beyond the Aristotelian principle of non-contradiction in his claim that in God all opposites coincide. At the same time, however, he is not anti-philosophical at all. His sense that we need to go beyond certain categories to approach the truth does not lead him to believe that faith is more important than reason. Rather, I would say, it makes him ponder what kind of reason, or perhaps better, what mode of knowing is fitting for the Christian search for truth. Let us note for now that the kind of philosophy Cusanus draws on is Christian platonism. This is a tradition that goes back to Augustine and Pseudo-Dionysius, both of whom greatly influenced Cusanus. He is also influenced by Proclus, Eriugena, and the school of Chartres, which in turn was influenced by Boethius. Another source of the Cusan's thought was Meister Eckhart. All of these thinkers are more influenced by Plato than by Aristotle, and with them, Cusanus thought that when it comes to the big picture of how to relate God and the world, the infinite and the finite, the transcendent and the immanent, a more Platonic approach is fruitful. In essence, this approach is based on the idea that all visible things are images of invisible things, and that visible things participate in God, each in their own way. And because of all of this, the Creator can be seen in creation as if in a kind of mysterious mirror. So, Cusanus was part of a movement of discovering Platonic Augustinian thought again after Aristotelianism had had its heyday in the Middle Ages. This is also evident from the way in which he wrote. Cusanus did not write commentaries on classical texts or try to synthesize everything into big summae. In fact, the older he got, the more he wrote in the very Platonic form of the dialogue. Sometimes he himself is one of the fictional interlocutors, but sometimes not. In his 3 dialogues on the layman, the insightful voice comes, as I have mentioned before, not from the cardinal, but from the humble layman. In any case, the form of a dialogue lends itself to shedding multiple perspectives on the same matter, and it supports a kind of learning which leads people by the hand, as it were. One particularly interesting dialogue from among Nicholas's works, one of the earliest ones he wrote, is a little work called An Apology for Learned Ignorance. He had to write this because his work on learned ignorance was heavily attacked by Johannes Wenck, an Aristotelian theologian. But first things first, what exactly did Cusanus teach in De Docta Ignorantia? And what was he accused of? You remember that Cusanus had a moment of deep insight when he was sailing home from Constantinople. We know of this because he attached a dedicatory letter to De Docta Ignorantia. In this letter, addressed to a teacher of his, Cusanus wrote, "Accept now, Reverend Father, what for so long I desired to attain by different paths of learning, but previously could not, until, returning by sea from Greece, when, by what I believe was a celestial gift from the Father of Lights, from whom comes every perfect gift, I was led to embrace incomprehensible things incomprehensibly, in learned ignorance, by transcending those incorruptible truths that can be humanly known." Now, this is a long sentence which needs some unpacking. Put simply, Cusanus was led to see that because God goes beyond the categories that we know, we cannot understand him in the ways we understand things normally. Instead, we need an alternative mode of understanding. And what he suddenly sees is that we can understand what is incomprehensible incomprehensibly in learned ignorance. How does this work? Well, Cusanus believes that God is the highest being beyond all comparison. God is what is most true ontologically, the highest unity. As this transcended being, God also transcends our reason and our intellect. We cannot comprehend God as God is. There's a radical apophatism here, a radical insight into the limits of our knowledge. But that's not all. Precisely because God is what is most ontologically true and most ontologically stable, God must be the beginning and end of all true knowledge. Now, if you take both together, that we cannot know God as he is, and that God is the beginning and end of all knowledge, there's a problem. How do we know anything at all if we cannot know God and yet he is the beginning and end of all knowledge? This is an aporia which Cusanus saw very clearly, and it bothered him for a long time. He tried to go beyond it, but could not, until he was led by what he believed was God's gift to the insight that we can understand God in a non-grasping way, in learned ignorance. The Latin phrase he uses at the beginning of the book is incomprehensibiliter intellegere. So it is about understanding, intellegere, in a way that does not fully comprehend, incomprehensibiliter. Or to use a more poetic expression by Cusanus himself, learned ignorance is when, in the darkness of our ignorance, the truth shines forth incomprehensibly. You can see that there is a balance here between stressing that our knowledge is limited when it comes to God, and yet still holding that we need not just remain silent. Non-grasping understanding is still a form of understanding. The truth still shines forth, even if incomprehensibly. But how do we proceed in this non-grasping understanding? In De Docta Ignorantia, Cusanus proposes first of all to attend to geometrical symbols. He stretches these symbols to their limits by imagining actually infinite forms. Take 3 lines, for example, one short, one a bit longer, and one very long. And then you imagine that you extend each of these lines to be infinitely long. Is the longest line still longer than the shortest? No, they are now both infinitely long. Cusanus goes quite far with geometrical examples like these in De Docta Ignorantia. If you try to imagine a triangle with infinitely long sides, for example, it really becomes the same thing as an infinite line. Or if you imagine a curve that is infinitely stretched, it similarly coincides with an infinite line. The point of all of this is to show that in an imagined infinity, things that seem mutually exclusive, like the line and the triangle, suddenly coincide. This goes beyond reason, strictly speaking, because reason is defined by the law of non-contradiction. And this is really what Cusanus is getting at, that there are things that go beyond reason. Here it is important to realize, though, that Cusanus distinguishes between reason, ratio, and intellect, intellectus. He inherits this distinction from Augustine. Reason is the capacity for knowing and understanding which functions according to certain rules. The most important of these rules is the law of non-contradiction. This law, in Aristotle's words, goes like this: it is impossible for the same attribute at once to belong to and not to belong to the same thing and in the same relation. But reason not only functions according to certain rules, it also operates by comparison. We learn new things by comparing them to what we already know. Imagine, for instance, that you are given a fruit that you have never seen or tasted before. What you would do is instantly compare it to the fruits you know. This looks a bit like a lemon, but it tastes much less sour. That's a typical operation of reason, to compare and contrast something new with something already known. There's nothing wrong with this kind of comparing if we deal with things that are comparable. But is God comparable in this way? No, says Cusanus. He is an absolute, and as such, and such an absolute cannot ever be reached by comparison. If we said God is more of this or less of that, more powerful than human beings or less stupid, then we would assume that there is a proportionality between God and creation. But Cusanus is adamant that there is no such direct proportion. No one doubts, he writes in De Docta Ignorantia, that there can be no proportion between the infinite and the finite. Cusanus calls God the absolute maximum, in the sense that God infinitely transcends all comparison and is beyond any more or less. All of this goes to say that reason is pushed to its limits whenever it tries to conceive of an absolute maximum or God in at least two ways. One, because if reason is already stretched by imagining infinite geometrical figures where opposites seem to coincide, how much more will it struggle to conceive of God who is transcendent? Two, because there is no good way of reaching God by way of comparisons. Reason is pushed to its limits. Now, this is where the intellect comes in. The faculty of the intellect is more like an intuitive vision, in contrast to reason, which always proceeds discursively. This means that the intellect can somehow think a coincidence of opposites. Or perhaps better, the intellect is the capacity that helps us understand that we sometimes need to go beyond certain categories and beyond comparisons. And it is also the intellect which allows us to have glimpses of that which lies beyond. So Nicholas's insight that there can be a learned ignorance is very much an insight into the limits of reason, but it is not anti-reason. It is a reflection on what is properly incomprehensible to reason, but also a reflection on how intellectually we might embrace what is incomprehensible in a different way, not grasping, not comprehending, yet still cherishing it, embracing it. This is learned ignorance as Cusanus understood it. I mentioned before that Cusanus faced some harsh criticism of his learned ignorance by his contemporaries. One traditional scholastic theologian called Johannes Wenck wrote an entire book against De Docta Ignorantia. He thought that Cusanus's approach undermined the very foundation of theology by pointing to the limits of reason. In the dialogue called Apologia, which I mentioned before, Cusanus responds to this critique, and the format he chooses is rather fun. It's a dialogue between two fictional students of Cusanus, where one of them tells the other what their teacher, Cusanus, thought of the accusations against his work. So he does not have to reply in his own voice or say directly how badly he thinks he has been misunderstood, but he can leave his students to be a little outraged on his behalf. Wenck's misunderstanding was that he thought Nicholas's critique of reason led to an irrationalism. But as we have seen for Cusanus, it is quite to the contrary. He does not fall into a blind irrationalism or fideism. Rather, he shows how we can have some sustained thinking even at the limits of reason. There's a higher kind of capacity than reason, which, even if it does not grasp or understand rationally, it still approaches and embraces that which goes beyond reason. Now, one specific facet of this learned ignorance is to see that the kind of thinking which presupposes opposites is limited to the finite realm. As soon as you think about infinity, even the actual infinity of geometrical forms, as we have seen, as soon as you think about infinity, things that seem otherwise mutually exclusive coincide. A line and a triangle, for instance. How much more so when we try to think an absolute infinite, an infinite beyond any figures or forms? How much more is this infinite beyond any opposites? And this is what the coincidence of opposites is about for Cusanus. Now, of course, for Cusanus, God is this absolute infinite. In his work, De Visione Dei, Cusanus writes that in order to know something of God, we must, and I quote, enter into obscuring mist and admit the coincidence of opposites beyond all capacity of reason. And then, addressing God, he says, "For you, God, have shown me that you cannot be seen elsewhere than where impossibility appears. And I have found the abode wherein you dwell unveiledly, an abode surrounded by the coincidence of contradictories or opposites."